My name is Brian Kane. I'm a professor of music theory at Yale University, and I have no PowerPoint. I have no audio to play. It's just a talk about Xenakis and biopolitics. So the title of the talk is Xenakis, the first composer of Biopolitics, with a question mark at the end. Among the many fascinating exchanges found in Xenakis' thesis defense, Art Sciences Alloys, I find the dialogue with Michel Serres to be one of the most provocative. Serres interrogates Xenakis about two seemingly contradictory themes. On the one hand, Xenakis' fascination for ruled invariants, like the ruled surfaces of the Phillips Pavilion, or the glissandi of metastasis. On the other hand, with a thermodynamic preoccupation to gliss or slide irreversibly towards disorder, toward background noise. After pursuing Xenakis along these two fronts, Serres poses a final question, which offers a path of reconciliation. He asks, starting from noise, can there be order? Xenakis states unequivocally, yes. Although noise is never self-repeating, Xenakis argues that the listener can perceive regularity within noise by moving perceptually from the macroscopically individual event to the macroscopically individual whole. And of course, anyone familiar with Xenakis' thought, as Serres was, is well aware of the consistency of this motive in Xenakis' writings and compositions. As for Serres, Xenakis' answer opens the door to a summary statement. Serres says, so the answer can now be given. Can order be established from noise? Well, your music was the first to discover this. I want to examine this claim for a moment. Serres, by positioning Xenakis' music as the first to discover this order, seems to be pointing out something unique about Xenakis' work, namely, that it becomes a point of articulation, a line in the sand. After Xenakis, composers of new music must negotiate with the discovery that order can be established from noise. Composers, from this point forward, du musst dein Leben ändern. However, I don't think this reading is correct. I think Serres is actually getting at a more nuanced claim. For the thesis defense was not the only time that Serres was to make a public statement about the relationship of order to noise. The theme appears again in Serres' book, The Five Senses, published nearly a decade after his exchange with Xenakis. Revisiting the mythic trope that music has a, quote, civilizing influence, putting Argus to sleep and reducing him to tears, unquote, Serres argues for a tripartite articulation of music, noise, and language. Noise, identified with chaos, is autonomous and indifferent. Music tames noise, softening the jagged edges of the tumult. However, this softening is not yet at the level of articulation or differentiation. Language, the third term, follows after music. Yet language, by binding itself to the specificity of meaning, gains particularity at the expense of universality. In its most schematic form, Serres argues the tripartite relationship of language, music, and noise as follows. Quote, language needs music, its essential condition. Music has no need of language. Music needs noise, its essential condition. Noise has no need of music. But lest you assume that the philosopher Serres is some kind of logophiliac in love with language, the Five Senses makes clear that his desideratum is universality, not specificity. In particular, Serres wants to invoke a musical universality tied not to the articulation of concepts in language, but bound to rhythmics, that substratum of all language. Unlike language, music carries no specific meaning, but both all and none. Music, writes Serres, universal before the advent of meaning, carries all meaning within it. Distilled, differentiated, language selects the meaning or meanings it will isolate from this complex and then broadcast. If the dialogue with Xenakis leads us to falsely assume that the establishment of order from noise was a particularly modern invention, Serres' argument in The Five Senses dislocates this discovery back into a mythic past. And I use the word mythic intentionally. In the pages of The Five Senses, Serres associates the figure of Orpheus with the originary moment of noise's taming. He writes, quote, Orpheus, all ears, his lyre or cithara held before him, is more than a match for the noise, confronting the problem and resolving it with music. Orpheus transformed noise into music, and no doubt invented it too, unquote. And thus, Xenakis too becomes associated with Orpheus, for he also discovers a music that brings order from noise. If we follow the logic of Serre's argument, then Xenakis' discovery, far from modern, is perhaps better understood as a rediscovery of the original mythical Orphic knowledge. A connection is made. Xenakis as Orpheus. Now, of course, you might be thinking, well, this isn't Xenakis' claim, right? I mean, he doesn't think of himself as Orpheus. And of course that's right. But I don't yet want to throw out the possible identification of Xenakis and Orpheus implied by Serre's claim. Many of you knew Xenakis personally, which is a privilege that I never had. But if compositions, architectural sketches, and writings can reveal something about their creator, I wonder if Xenakis wouldn't be secretly pleased by this identification with the very ancient and very Greek figure of music, Orpheus. For there remains something mythic about Xenakis' thinking as well, or at least that's going to be part of my argument today. To clarify what I mean by myth, I take my lead from Roland Barthes' Mythologies. Myth, writes Barthes, deprives the object of which it speaks of all history. In it, history evaporates. It is a kind of ideal servant. It prepares all things, brings them, lays them out, the master arrives, it silently disappears. All that is left for one to do is to enjoy this beautiful object. In Barthes' text, these myths are enacted in the reception of everyday commodities, like soap, whose very presence evokes a flurry of rhetoric centered on the figure of a holy war waged on dirt. The enemy is killed or forced out, the savior penetrating deep into the linens, as if linens had depth, and endlessly proliferating into a vigorous foam, revealing a higher purpose and miraculously defying the laws of physics. Lather creates something from nothing and manifests a healthy and powerful essence. For the mythic object, there is no genealogy or archaeology of its power. It is the eternal present, the true, the good, the beautiful. Writing in 1957, 1 year before the Philips Pavilion, which we must not forget was used to advertise Philips' brand of audio and visual products in action, Barthes tries to counteract mythic abstraction by subjecting it to the chilly bath of history. I will attempt something similar today. I wonder if certain forms of mathematics aren't playing the role of the mythic object in Xenakis' thinking. As a way of pursuing this question, I want to take a closer look at a piece of mathematics central to Xenakis' practice and try to think about it historically. Namely, I want to talk about the so-called law of large numbers and the role it plays in Xenakis' use of probability theory. I've always found it odd that given the centrality of probability theory to Xenakis' compositional work, it barely registers on the chart of correlations between math and music reproduced as the first appendix in Alloys. It is lumped under the heading 1700 to 1800 AD, a huge span of time filled with social and political upheavals. True, this is the period in which Poisson develops the law of large numbers, but there is more that we can say about this law if we start to look at its history. I recommend to anyone who's interested in the history of probability theory that you check out Ian Hacking's excellent book, The Taming of Chance. According to Hacking's research, Poisson developed his account of the law of large numbers in a very specific context, the so-called French jury problem. In the 1830s, Poisson became interested in a judicial debate raging in France over which was better, a jury that decides by simple majority or a jury that decides by a majority of at least 8 to 4. Poisson's small treatise of 1837, entitled, in my approximate English rendering, quote, "On the probability of judgments in civil and criminal matters, preceded by the general rules for the calculation of probabilities," unquote, approached this social problem based on governmental data concerning conviction rates, alongside applied techniques from probability theory. The central question was this: what kind of majority will give you the least number of wrong convictions, 7 to 5 or 8 to 4? Throughout the 1830s, French laws had changed back and forth about the proper constitution of the jury majority. Poisson used his research to intervene in these debates and argue that the more conservative decision was well-founded. One problem that emerged in Poisson's work concerned calculating the reliability of a juror's judgment. According to Hacking, quote, "Some jurors are more reliable than others. Poisson's law of large numbers was devised in order to solve just this problem," unquote. But Poisson's law was initially ill-received. Many debates ensued within French mathematical societies about the veracity of the law. By the 1840s, Poisson's work on the French jury problem and his formulation of the law of large numbers were generally neglected, viewed as of a piece with an aging regime that believed in the application of mathematics to moral science in the style of the Enlightenment. According to Hacking, quote, by the 1840s, almost no one believed that there was a mathematical solution to the jury problem, and so all of Poisson's techniques fell by the wayside. Nobody gave a fig either for his exact computations or for his methods of reasoning, unquote. Only in the 1890s, with new developments in probability theory in St. Petersburg and Berlin, was Poisson's little book on civil and criminal matters rediscovered and translated, albeit with a new, less specific title, Treatise on Probability Theory and some of its most important applications. It was only at this later stage that the examples most associated with the law of large numbers came into being, like the calculation of the rate with which Prussian officers of the 1890s were injured by being kicked by their horses. That's the classic example, right? Okay. This fascinating history of the law of large numbers is significant for two reasons. First, I think that one can use it as a chilly bath against the mythic identifications that Xenakis draws in formalized music between the implications of the law of large numbers and the negotiations between determinism and indeterminism first promoted in the Epicurean philosophy. Second, rather than deny the important applications of the law of large numbers to a variety of phenomena, I would argue that the very conceptualization of physical and social phenomena as conforming, or at least capable of being modeled and simulated by the laws and theorems of probability theory, must not be taken as an eternal truth, nor one that dates back to philosophical antiquity. For this conceptualization is part and parcel of a new regime of power, as Foucault has persuasively argued, one that emerges over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, which he refers to as biopolitics. So, what is biopolitics? The concept only appears in Foucault's late writings and lectures. Basically, in the 19th century, with the final overcoming of models of European political power based on the sovereign, a new model of power begins to emerge, one that must be differentiated from the old model of discipline that Foucault treated in Discipline and Punish. Foucault writes, and I'm going to give a fairly large quotation from Foucault so you get the sense of what biopolitics is about. Foucault writes, unlike discipline, which is addressed to bodies, this new non-disciplinary power is not applied to man as body, but to the living man, to man as living being, ultimately, if you like, to man as species, and that the new technology of power is addressed to a multiplicity of men, not to the extent that they are nothing more than their individual bodies, but to the extent that they form, on the contrary, a global mass affected by overall processes characteristic of birth, death, production, illness, and so on. After the disciplinary anatomopolitics of the human body established in the course of the 18th century, i.e. discipline, we have, at the end of that century, the emergence of something that is no longer an anatomopolitics of the human body, but what I would call a biopolitics of the human race. As evidence of this emergence of biopolitical power, Foucault cites the rising governmental practice of keeping statistics about the activities and actions of the population. With the consolidation of power into central governments and the encroaching power of the market as a site of verifaction, as a place which produces its own laws, truths, and demands against governmental regulation, the problem of control moves beyond the point-to-point disciplinary model of the sovereign. The new domains of biopolitical control are aimed at the level of the population, not the individual. For Foucault, this includes geographical, climatic, and hydrographic problems, such as swamps, epidemics, and man-made crises mapped and plotted on grids and in ledgers treating the birth rate, the mortality rate, various biological disabilities, and the effects of the environment. Taken individually, the phenomena of concern are unpredictable, but become statistically regular, conceptualized by biopolitical power as, quote, aleatory events that occur within a population that exists over a period of time. Foucault also points out that the mechanisms of biopolitical control are very different from older disciplinary mechanisms which displayed the power of the sovereign on the body of its subjects. Biopolitical mechanisms include forecasts, statistical estimates, and overall measures. According to Foucault, their purpose is not to modify any given phenomena as such, any given phenomenon as such, or to modify any given individual insofar as he is an individual, but essentially to intervene at the level at which these general phenomena are determined. What emerges from the use of biopolitical mechanisms is a new category, the normal. Directed at no individual in particular, the normal becomes the standard by which to measure deviations and identify potentially hazardous or fortuitous trends. Now that we've introduced the concept of biopolitics, we're in a position to revisit Serre's claim. Rather than place Xenakis' achievement in terms of a rediscovery of Orphic knowledge, or even simply the discovery that order can emerge from noise, I'd like to suggest that Xenakis is perhaps the first composer whose method is profoundly influenced by biopolitics. Take, for instance, Xenakis' claim about the role of abstraction in 20th century art, as presented in his essay, Notes Towards an Electronic Gesture. Xenakis writes, quote, "Abstraction here is meant in the sense of conscious manipulation of laws and pure ideas, and not of concrete objects," unquote. Abstraction, lighting the path which will eventually converge towards the integration of the visual and the audible arts, is necessary for developing, quote, "pure ideas that exist within events and anecdotal objects, but that become detached from them in order to form concepts that are necessary for perceiving and controlling in a wider, faster, and easier way all the relationship between volume and light." The move to the macroscopic moves away from the individual concrete object towards perception and manipulation of the population as a whole. So let me sharpen this up a bit. Although Xenakis claims that, quote, "the beginning of conscious abstraction in music takes place with the discovery of atonality based on the equivalence of the 12 tempered sounds," unquote, this claim needs some unpacking. Xenakis makes it seem in his discourse as if the equivalence of the 12 tones is simply a statistical norm. But this is in contrast to Schoenberg's conceptualization of 12-tone practice, which is still directed at the level of the individual note and its placement within the series and the harmonic context. In fact, all tones are not equivalent in Schoenberg's practice, which is why there is a taboo on repetition of a tone before the row is complete. Abstraction, in the sense that Xenakis defines it, as a way of forming concepts necessary for wider, faster, and easier control, is utterly different in motivation from Schoenberg's kind of abstraction. Unlike Schoenberg, who is still thinking about music at the level of the note, Xenakis is working at the level of the population. Perhaps this is unsurprising. If one considers the central role that the classical syntax occupied in the construction of the Schoenbergian musical sentence, we may be able to discern the inheritance of an older, representative, and disciplinary form of power, i.e., maybe Schoenberg is still fairly 18th century. And similarly for Xenakis, working in the office of Corbusier, contributing to projects like the massive governmental complex of Chandigarh, we might not be so surprised that his thinking captures newer forms of political power. If we stick to the year 1958, the year in which this essay on electronic gesture was written, we can hear precisely such an attempt to control populations of sounds in a wider, faster, and easier way in Xenakis' Concrète PH, with its proto-granular, statistically organized clouds of clicks and pops. Or, moving beyond that piece, one could look at the off-cited section of Pitho Proctor, where the kinetic theory of gases is applied to produce a passage of wild glissandi, and other examples abound. Yet Xenakis describes the application of stochastic laws to sonic events with a detachment and brutality that is often breathtaking. The most famous example comes at the beginning of formalized music, where Xenakis describes the phenomena of a political crowd. The rhetorical power and detachment of this passage comes partly from its implicit perspective on the crowd, which I should note is a kind of sublime perspective on the crowd, not the perspective of a participant. Although Xenakis never explicitly states it, he places the reader in the position of an observer above the phenomena. The protesters form a human river. Slogans move from back to front, but never over or through. After the bullets fly, the reader watches the crowd disperse. And the moral of the story is that these statistical laws, quote, "separated from their political or moral context, are the same as those of the cicadas or the rain. They are stochastic laws," unquote. Yes, they are stochastic laws. But we must understand that the caveat, which separates these laws from their political or moral context, is only available to the biopolitical thinker who can see the function of the stochastic law as a way of modeling or controlling populations. Thus, a type of biopolitical anonymity emerges. The impersonality of Xenakis' work, which is shared by the impersonality of this moment of European high modernism, is also found in Corbusier. Think for a moment of the modular, its impersonal, heroic, silhouetted figure, and its derivation from the normal proportions of the human body. But it is the connection of this impersonality with a mythical abstraction from history that I find uncomfortable. It's one thing to be able to speak the language of biopolitics, for what alternative is there? Not a return to the spectacular disciplinary model of monarchical sovereignty. But the removal of history from biopolitical consciousness is troubling, I think. I find it troubling in Corbusier's fetishistic attachment of the functional nature of the modular with the golden section, which is obviously intended to evoke the aura of Greek temples and ancient secret wisdom. I'm similarly troubled by Xenakis' conflation of the normal and the natural, as if the application of stochastic laws to human and natural phenomena meant that those laws lack their own history. What this reveals is a tendency for Xenakis to blur two categories that should remain distinct, the natural and the normal. The normal is often treated as if it were the natural. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into great detail to support this assertion, but rather I refer you to the very end of Arts, Sciences, Alloys, page 98 in the English translation, where Xenakis explicitly equates these two terms. The utility of placing Xenakis' thought in the framework of biopolitics is that it affords us a lever by which to pry apart the normal from the natural. The stochastic laws that govern the political crowd, the swarm of cicadas and the falling of hail, can be seen as particularly modern ways of conceptualizing the world. The laws can be read against the grain, and thus read as socially constructed facts. This is not to debase their power to model mass phenomena, but simply to say something about the historical conditions of possibility that allow Xenakis to deploy these laws in the first place. Let's be clear. Even if the discovery of order from noise was indeed the achievement of Orpheus, as Serre claims, it was also the achievement of statisticians, bureaucrats, and mathematicians in 19th century France and elsewhere. However, it is the difference in technique and what these differences reveal about how the world is conceptualized and constructed that makes all the difference. By encouraging us to disentangle the normal and the natural in Xenakis' work, I intend not to depreciate its aesthetic achievement, but I seek to appreciate and understand it better. For example, one often takes Xenakis' lead when discussing the relationship between music and architecture, pointing to the shared morphology of ruled surfaces that constitutes the hyperbolic paraboloids that form the volumes of the Phillips Pavilion, as well as the overlapping glissandi in the score of Metastasis. The argument is persuasively presented in the opening pages of Formalized Music. One doesn't even have to read the text, just look at the first three pictures. Yet, is it simply the shared morphology of the ruled surface that links the musical and the architectural? A morphology doesn't have a history. No doubt the Phillips Pavilion and Metastasis share a similar morphology. I'm not disputing that. But generally speaking, this approach seems limited in its ability to make sense of the larger relations and habits of thinking that permeate Xenakis' work. In other words, once we move beyond this example, I find it very hard to understand sometimes the relationship between music and architecture in Xenakis based on the idea that ruled surfaces are the unifying feature. I would propose that by placing Xenakis' work within the frame of biopolitics, one could begin to read in both the musical and the architectural work a set of social techniques that are broader than either domain. So, rather than look for syntheses of the visual and the musical, I would suggest that we situate the whole domain of Xenakis' aesthetic creation within the regime of power that he clearly embodies. We begin with the common field, namely biopolitics, and then we see how the music and the architecture distinctly, but also often in conjunction, can operate at the level of the population. The advantage of this method is that we stop looking for systems of greater abstraction with which to speak of the conjunction between music and architecture, as Xenakis himself suggests in his neo-Wagnerian total electronic gesture. And mathematics, by the way, would be another language of abstraction that would link these two things. So rather than do that, we start talking about how abstraction gets pragmatically applied to various domains. Only in the light of this reversal can we also disentangle Xenakis' conflation of the normal and the natural. In other words, Xenakis as modernist, not Xenakis as Orpheus. Thank you.